Record. So thank you everyone for joining us. My name's Tina McIntyre and I'm the Florida Friendly Landscaping Agent at the UF IFAS Extension in Seminole County. And joining me here today, we have Tiare Silvasi. She's the Florida Friendly Landscaping Agent in Orange County. So we're happy to work together today to talk about how to compost, reduce waste while helping your landscape. So without further ado, we will dive in. And again, just a quick note that if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A so we can be sure we don't overlook it in the chat box. Chat box is for just a quick shout out. And if you want to just comment. So for those of you that might not know about the University of Florida IFAS Extension, we are in every single county throughout the state. So there is an office in every single county, and some of them offer different programming than others, but it usually falls within agriculture, could be ranching, could be farming, but we also offer a lot of great urban programming too. So urban farming, we have family and consumer sciences, which is nutrition education, financial education. We have our 4-H programming, which is our youth programming, which covers a variety of topics from robotics to entomology. And then, of course, we have our master gardeners, where we train volunteers to help us help residents. So get involved, check out Extension. We are an equal opportunity institution, available and open to all. So for those of you that are Seminole County residents, you do have to have a valid address in Seminole County, and you might be eligible to win one of 50 geo-bins. Now, again, you don't need this to compost. You'll find that out today. But if you are a Seminole County resident, you stay the full hour and you complete our survey that will be sent either probably by tomorrow, then you do qualify to win one of 50. And I think we're having about 92 people with us today. So your chances are pretty good, about 50% there at this current moment. So yeah, and then in about 3 to 6 months, so we'll send a survey immediately, but then in 3 to 6 months, we're gonna follow up with you and we are gonna ask you, did you get a bin? Did you put the bin down? Did you make a bin? Are you composting? Are you saving your kitchen scraps? We want to follow up to know if you've been able to accomplish some of these successes. So please, check out those surveys.
Yeah, so let me tell everybody about the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. Both myself and Tina are Florida Friendly Landscaping Agents. So we are your local resources. I'm in Orange County, she's in Seminole County, to help you make good decisions on how to care for the landscape in a way that protects our environment. So Florida has such beautiful resources, our springs, our lakes, and our rivers. And by using the 9 Florida friendly principles that are listed here, such as the right plant in the right place, and watering efficiently, mulching, and using the least toxic kind of pest controls to manage your yard pests, we can help to preserve our environment and prevent pollutants from going into our waterways. So please know that what you do in your yard does affect our environment at large, and use these 9 principles. They all work together. We'll have other classes that, get into each of them individually, or an overall class that will talk about all 9 of them. Today, we're going to be talking about principle number 7, which is to recycle the yard waste.
That's right. Thank you, Tia, for that nice overview. We all love to get out there and recreate in our beautiful state. I know I was just at one of the springs over the weekend and just enjoying that. And every action that we do on our properties, in our communities, does add up. And so we want to embrace composting, that principle number 7, recycle yard waste. So why don't you tell us a little bit about why we compost?
Yeah, well, recycling yard waste and composting is part of that. Composting also can encompass your food waste, your household waste, some of your paper waste. We'll go all over the materials you can compost later, but there are so many benefits to compost. It's hard to even quantify some of them because they're so numerous and small. So looking at the little pictures here, improve soil structure, texture, and aeration. They help to loosen compact soil. So compost just gets into the soil. It helps to retain the water. It helps to retain nutrients, and it helps with the overall tilth and friability of the soil in a way that will help the plants grow. It will help the nutrients get into the plants. It will help the plants absorb the water. It helps with the soil fertility and the root development because the roots can get through that nice composty soil. And most importantly, it's creating a favorable environment for microorganisms. So I know me and Tina are real microbe kind of dorks, and you can study, get down that rabbit hole pretty far. But think of microorganisms as probiotics for our landscape. So we always want healthy microorganisms out there, which include bacteria and fungi, and they're microscopic organisms that are helping to break down organic matter and make these nutrients available for our plants. And then lastly, composting and recycling waste helps to reduce waste in our landfills. So, we don't want a bunch of landfills. We would rather have more area for natural lands and trees and parks. And then all the pollution too that comes with landfills, such as methane gas from the material being biodegraded in there. So there's many reasons to compost.
Yeah, it just, when you have a fistful of sand versus a fistful of compost, the compost is soft, spongy, it's just so welcoming to those roots. So that's really where we want to go for our plants to be healthy and start off, like Tia said, with that good probiotic. So thinking about our landfills, I actually, for my last job, had the privilege of walking into the laboratory one day and somebody brought the leachate from the landfill. And that's basically, landfills have to be tested and the water coming off of it is tested to make sure that it's in compliance. But it is very stinky. And, when we create that, garbage can that goes off to, the landfill, it does contribute. So according to the Environmental Protection Authority, we have about 13% of all landfills is yard waste, or about 3.5 million tons. That's quite a lot. And so if we can actually divert that not only from the landfill, but sequester it into that benefit of making compost and enhancing our soils, making our plants healthier, that's really where we want to go. So, less landfills, less leachate, and more beneficial, beneficial things for the environment.
Yeah, and let me just add that depending on where you live, what county or municipality that you live in, they have different processes. In Orange County, they grind up the yard waste and make compost out of it. In other counties, they might just mulch it and make mulch out of it. So it depends on your location, how exactly the landfill works.
That's right. That's right. And some counties don't separate it out. That's a national statistic from the Environmental Protection nationwide. And so we are very fortunate in Central Florida that in Seminole County, you can go to Geneva and get mulch. In Orange County, you can go to off of Dean Road and get compost. So there are those resources at our municipal levels. And so kind of diving into how do we compost, getting this process started. Well, the benefit is that you have nature working with you. So you have, the natural propensity of things to break down. So here's a really cool photo Tia took that just shows, the forest in nature. This is our natural habitat here in Florida. It's going to be, shedding those leaves, and then the leaves fall to the ground. And if you were to kind of scratch the surface of that first layer of leaves, you're not going to see a lot of leaves under that, because as the seasons go by, those leaves break down and they create what we call topsoil. And they create an organic material and enhance that soil. So that's what we want to mimic here by adding this organic material to our landscape and really harnessing the power of nature that already happens. A lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, it's just you put the right kind of pieces together and you're going to be moving forward with a great compost pile. So I like to put this question out for people to consider when you're starting to compost. Do you want to compost because you want garden soil? I think most of us do, but you don't have to. So a lot of people can just purely want the goal of diverting that waste from the landfill. And I think regardless, it's good to ask yourself that, because if you're really dedicated and you have a lot of time, you're going to commit to turning your pile, cutting, things into smaller pieces. You might be more specific about what you add in, and you're going to be more proactive about it. Where if you are maybe more in the lazy camp, such as I, where you work full time and you're just kind of busy, where you want to compost, but you're not going to be kind of cutting things into little pieces. Maybe you're not turning it as much. Maybe you want to be more flexible about what you add in. That's still great, because you're still reducing that waste going to the landfill. So you can certainly have both goals. I don't want you to think I have to pick one or the other, but it's just kind of flavors the understanding of how you're going to approach your composting. And if you really are going to be dedicated, you're going to get that soil quicker. You're going to get that compost humus product, maybe a little quicker and stuff like that.
Yeah, and you can be a blend of those. Like, I'm kind of in the middle. I do use my compost, but I'm not out there turning it every week, but I still get a finished product to put back in my garden.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. Yeah. So, we might spend, 1 week that we're on vacation or whatnot, maybe turn it a little more often, or actually harvesting it, applying it to the landscape. But yeah, it's just a good kind of framework to think about what your goals are. So thinking about what compost is, and as we show you how to get to that final product, compost is going to be dark, crumbly, kind of soft and spongy. It's going to have microorganisms that have broken down all the stuff. So you're not going to see a lot of leaves and twigs and grass clippings. During the process you will, but then you get to that final compost, and that's the humus. So it really does, the addition of time is what changes compost to humus. Time, heat, microbes, we need all these things to turn the compost into the humus. And we just kind of use those different terms to say, okay, well, I just put in the banana peels, so it's not humus yet. But then when we're actually harvesting out that final product, we might refer to it as the humus, which is fully composted, fully developed. So, this might seem obvious to some, but I don't assume everybody knows that we want to think about what can be composted. And we're going to get into details on this, but no plastic, unless it's 100% biodegradable. They are making a lot of those foam trays and different plastics that are biodegradable these days, which is great. But those still do take quite a while to break down unless it's paper derivative. So just, be judicious with that. If you're putting in one of those, even if it's biodegradable, but if it's plastic, it's still going to take a fair amount of time to break down. And then, anything that's really waxy or has like a really thick coating. So some of our cardboard boxes, brown, are fantastic. No, nothing on it. Some of those cardboard boxes can have an extra seal, a little bit of a plastic coating type of thing, a lot of waxiness. So you want to kind of avoid that stuff.
Yeah, and if you're not sure, just put it in there and see if it composts, and maybe it won't.
Yeah, and then you'll know because it'll still be in there. And so you can just pick it out. And sometimes as we're harvesting or turning, you might find a little piece of plastic that somehow got in there, or it was a little sticker that was on that avocado or whatever have you, and so you want to kind of pick through that compost and just make sure, you're not contributing to any
Yeah,
plastics in there.
the rubber band on the broccoli.
Yeah, sometimes you're just chopping, in the kitchen, and then you go to put it in the jar, and oh, there goes the rubber band too. We didn't even notice until later. So
Yep.
just pick them out.
No harm.
That's right. That's right. So when we're thinking about composting at home, there's a ton of things that we can actually incorporate. Here's a nice long list. And for those of you joining us today through Zoom, I will be emailing you a version of this. So, don't feel like you have to get it all down now. You can actually look at this later and, take a deeper dive. So, but just to kind of name a few, we mentioned banana peels. One thing that kind of sticks out to people is human hair, animal hair. When you're cleaning your brush, that is biodegradable. We are part of kind of that organic material. So we can compost human hair, and we have obviously manures are a great addition. We'll get into that a little bit further, but essentially you want to stick with our ruminant animals, our cows, poultry, so chickens and turkeys, things like that, those kinds of manures. Wood chips can be good. General rule is no larger than your thumb. So you can do branches and wood chips, but you don't want to get too big because that's going to kind of take even longer. Or maybe at the bottom of the pile, it'll kind of, squish it as it, you put more things in there. Leaves, peanut shells. How about you, Tia, on this list? What kind of stands out to you?
Oh yeah, I like to do it all. I'm a big composter, and yeah, people are asking old seeds, can newspaper be recycled? Yes, and the ink on the newspaper is no longer from heavy metals. Back in the 80s, they went to soy-based inks, so that's pretty safe. I would avoid the glossy paper type of stuff.
Yeah, and I know I get a lot of junk mail, and some of it is kind of that, political waxy stuff, and so maybe I don't put that in, but the more newspaper type print, it goes right into my worm bin or my compost pile. And so there's a ton of stuff. Even we just had Valentine's Day. If you got flowers, don't throw them in the trash, throw them in the compost pile, because those are gonna break down. Those petals and stems will be a great addition to that pile. So, it's not just food, it's paper products. It's a lot of the pleasantries that we purchase for our homes and different items. Obviously, leaves are created in our landscape. So, think broadly. Even I actually have in each one of my bathrooms, I have a little extra trash can. It's just a small one that I can put, the little inside tube of the toilet paper, or maybe tissues, all this stuff is going to break down. So we want to, use that as a nice contribution to our pile.
Yeah, let me just go into this a little bit further. There's a lot of questions in the chat about, what can be composted, what cannot. Definitely not dog or cat poop, because that is may contain pathogens. They're carnivorous animals, whereas the ones that Tina mentioned are more herbaceous animals, like eating grass, like the cows and the horses. And so some other things to avoid are the weed seeds and diseased plants. So this is depending on your composting level. Easy to kill weeds are safe to put in the compost, but if you have some very hard to kill weeds like nutsedge or wedelia or torpedo grass, those are things that are probably better not to be composted, because your pile is not likely to reach a temperature that will kill it, and you don't want to end up putting those weeds back into your garden. So other areas of caution here with the asterisks are the meat or cheese and the fish. And so you can put those in, they will be composted, but you have to use caution because one, they do attract pests. Raccoons will come digging for a fish. So you really have to bury it deep inside of the compost pile. The other thing is that they can harbor some pathogens. So you want to compost them at a hot temperature or for a longer amount of time to make sure all those pathogens are killed. So if you want to be conservative in your composting, leave all those items out. If you have a bigger pile and you're more comfortable with it, then you can put those items in. So kind of like how you do your landscape, you can be in control of your compost pile and what goes in there. We talked about bread or rice. Those will also kind of attract some animals, all those carbohydrates. But if you chop them up and bury them and put them in deep, then they shouldn't attract any pests. Citrus is another thing people have questions of. So if you just having a lemon in your iced tea, that's not a big deal. If you have a whole citrus tree and you're juicing 100 oranges and you just put all the oranges in the compost pile the same day, it's going to make the pile a little acidic. Same with the wood ashes. So wood ashes can be used sparingly, but they will increase the pH of your pile and kind of throw it off. So, just a couple cups at a time of wood ashes. And then, the things in the green side, the watermelon rind, the nutshells, the paper towels, you can rip up your paper and the inside rolls of that, the chicken manure, the cow, the horse manure, and all kinds of fruit and veggie stuff.
Yeah, the fruit peels, the veggie peels, those are just perfect candidates.
Yeah.
I know around my house we don't have a lot of meat or cheese waste. The cheese in particular pretty much gets eaten up. So that is also the preferred solution, is just consume what you bought and really try to manage that a little better so that you're not creating that waste to begin with. And then, if you do need to, if obviously not eating expired food and bad food, then is it a candidate for composting?
Yeah, and Tina, on the next slide, just go ahead and tell them a little bit more of the reasons why we want to be cautious about those couple items.
Yeah, so definitely with our weeds, our seed-laden weeds, are diseased plants. So if you brought something to extension that had a virus, a plant that had a virus, or maybe there was a really bad infestation or something, or like you said, if it might be an invasive plant, something like that, then we don't want to put that in your compost bin, because typically in the home landscape, we're not getting hot enough for it to destroy and denature those seeds. So now if say it's, about a month ago, we had some weeds in our yard, they didn't have any flowers, they didn't have any seeds. Some of the things around right now don't have any seeds on them. Say, for example, Bidens, if you're weeding that around your house, you could add that to the pile if it's just in the vegetative form. Once it starts to flower and produce those seeds, then, you could be spreading them around your landscape. So it's just something to take care of with, especially those invasive species. Same thing with using herbicide, fungicide, and pesticides. You may spread those to new plants. So say you have a vegetable garden where you've been treating some, something stronger with an invasive species. You just want to avoid that because, again, the heat might not raise enough to denature those chemicals.
Yeah, and we say like 30 days is a good, if you treated it within the last 30 days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then again, with our meats, bones, oils, any kind of salad dressings that are really just fatty, again, it might attract those animals or produce a bad smell. So, if you have a really hot pile and it's big and you know what you're doing, you can consider that. But really, in the home landscape, we're not producing enough to really get that temperature elevated to make it safe. And then with the carnivores, the carnivores are eating meat. And so, for example, dogs, where we don't want to introduce that into our pile. So there's a possibility of disease. And so we really just want to stick with our herbivores and, cow, horse, poultry, chicken, think farm animals, basically. Farm animals are pretty safe, where we're thinking, pets, cats, dogs, other things, not so much. So that's a good kind of rule of thumb.
Yeah, that's right. Now, let me break this down a little further and start to separate these into the greens and the browns. So we let you know about all the materials that can be composted. And in order to kind of build your pile in the proper way, you want to be layering brown and green and brown and green. The base layer is usually done with brown materials. Think of a sandwich. So the bread is the brown, and you can start it off with some leaves and stuff. That's if you have a big, a stick that's not too large, you can put that in at the bottom too. Your palm fronds, your shredded cardboard or newspaper, that's good kind of brown materials. They usually look brown, and so we just call them brown. And then the greens, they're the fresh, the nitrogen rich materials, such as grass clippings, weeds, your garden trimmings, aquatic weeds, your fruit and vegetable scraps, the eggshells, your coffee grinds. Even though they're brown, they still go in the green category because they're high in nitrogen, whereas browns are high in carbon. And then, the farm animal manure too can also be considered a green because of the high nitrogen content.
Yeah, and I'll just add a silly anecdote. I was watching a thing on Mars the other day. They were kind of diving into the planet Mars, and they found organic material. And that's kind of a really interesting revelation. And we take it for granted here on Earth, but the browns are high in carbon. And so those are really a big component of our organic material. And so when we think about creating organic material, enhancing that in our Florida soils, one of those building blocks essentially is carbon. So we want to reach out for a fair amount of those browns, and then also have our greens, which provide nitrogen. So the combination of those browns, the carbon with the greens, the nitrogen, that's where we start to get into really great composting. So thank you for giving us
materials, the better.
Yep. And yep, the diversity of materials. So there's basically what we call the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And again, this can get a little scientific, and we'll just kind of gloss over it a little bit. But I don't want you to get too caught up in this ratio and say, oh no, well, I can't put this in because I don't have that. And my ratio, essentially every single thing that you're going to be adding to your pile will have a different ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio. So for example, our sawdust is 600 carbon to 1 nitrogen. So lots and lots of carbon. So we basically know that that's a brown, right? Where if we're looking at food waste, still pretty, higher on the carbon to nitrogen, but the ratio is not as much. So we know that those are going to be more on the green side. So again, kind of sticking with the generalities, that if it's brown and, kind of high in carbon, kind of it has a dryness to it, the newspapers, the leaves, the sawdust, the straw, that's going to be in our browns. And then the more liquidy stuff, like if you left it for a day by itself, it gets smelly and kind of squishy. Those are going to be your greens. And so just kind of know that there's the science behind this, which is that carbon to nitrogen ratio. Again, the carbon is really a magic ingredient, but the nitrogen is as well. So how do we simplify this ratio?
Yeah, give us the simplified version.
Right. So let's say we have 1 bag of greens, which is here our grass clippings, which literally are green, but they're also high in nitrogen, right? So if we left this bag just by itself in the sun, it would kind of get stinky. It would kind of get a little maybe squishy after a day. It would kind of start matting together. Where with the leaves, it's going to take a couple weeks to start kind of degrading, and maybe some rain to get the humidity up. And so, you can kind of tell that they're different in that way as well. But if we mix them together in 1 part greens and 2 part browns, we're going to have a nice, ratio for our compost pile. So, you can reduce this down. Obviously, not everybody has a big old bag of grass clippings every day, but say you have a glass jar full of food scraps, then you need 2 glass jars full of leaves to balance that out. So 1 part greens to 2 part browns is a pretty safe estimation for that.
Yeah, and remember the sandwich theory: brown on the bottom, green in the middle, brown on the top.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. So how can we speed up this process? If we are in the camp that like, hey, we want to have a banging fall vegetable garden and we're going to start now. How can we speed up this process? Well, adding small pieces. So if you do have a banana peel, just kind of scissoring it up real quick can help. Now, it's again not necessary. The microbes can do that for you, but if there's more edges for them to start digesting at, it's going to go quicker. So chopping things up into small pieces, you can have your pile bigger. So adding more material, raising that heat, and then turning it frequently. So, if you get in there daily or at least weekly to give the pile a little turn, a little aeration, and turning can be as simple as sticking your pitchfork in, leveraging it and just letting some air into the pile. That is really pretty critical for speeding up the process. And then again, getting that ratio good. So if it's looking really wet and really kind of, stinky, adding some browns. If it's looking really dry and it's kind of cold and, there's not a lot happening there, putting in your greens. So, getting that good understanding of, what's going on with my compost pile right now? Is it too hot? Is it too wet? And that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and we just had a question about watering. We do want the pile to be moist, but not wet, kind of like a wrung out sponge, because you can't compost like a dry leaf. You want it to be moist so that all the microbes and insects can eat it and decompose it.
Yeah, that's why the greens and the browns really are a perfect relationship to make that compost, because when you add them together, they just kind of balance each other out, and it makes the microbes, it really fosters an ideal environment for those microbes. So saving your scraps, really, we think about yard waste a lot, but we need to get those nitrogen in our pile, the nitrogen stuff. And so a great way to do that is through our kitchen. And even if you don't cook, if you just eat fruit, and cook a basic egg breakfast, you can find stuff to add to your compost pile. And I like to do it using a glass jar just to the side of my sink so I can kind of see what's going on in there. If it's really been a day or two, okay, I got to take it outside. Some people like to put it in their freezer. Some people like it in a 5-gallon bucket under the sink.
Yeah,
with a lid. I definitely recommend a lid regardless of what you do, because it is going to keep out any flies and maggots, and kind of keep the smell in. So lids are pretty key regardless of where you have it. Tia, how do you save them in your kitchen?
Yeah, well, that picture there of the food scraps, that's my picture, and I put it in my freezer, and I do not use a lid because the freezer is kind of sanitary enough. I don't have any bugs in my freezer, so that's
right.
good.
Yeah,
I'm not really
is the lid.
Fan of like leaving it out at room temperature, because it's pretty hot here in Florida and it tends to get stinky and attract bugs in my house right away. But they have those cool little composters with the carbon screen. So whatever method works good for you. If you guys have a good method, put it in the chat box so everybody else can know what you're doing.
Yeah, we're always learning.
Someone says freezing it in a brown paper bag, and then you can add that whole bag to the compost.
Oh, that's
or
a cool
plastic
idea.
Folgers coffee container.
Yep, coffee container. Very good. So it sounds like we have some people composting already. That's awesome. So what can we do with all these branches that are in our yard? You know, we might have some winter pruning that we did, or coming up on springtime pruning, and we might have some branches that fell from storms. Well, we can use those, but really, if they're bigger than your thumb, they're probably too big for a compost pile. I do like to use some branches at the bottom when I'm building my first compost. So when you start fresh, you put some branches in there, just kind of allows the airflow along the bottom, and eventually they'll biodegrade. So that's kind of a nice little tip to use some of them. But really, you know, this big branch pile, you might want to considering just making a brush pile. You know, if you have enough space, brush piles can be great for wildlife, lots of insects, and then the birds will eat the insects. And so brush piles are great. You can also chip it up. You know, if you have some kind of a machete or even just a trash can, to be able to kind of break them down with even running a lawnmower over them. And once they're smaller, then you can use them in the compost. But you really want to just kind of decide again, how aggressive, how proactive am I going to be with my compost pile? And do I want to kind of spend time breaking this up?
Yeah, I use my branches and just make a little campfire in the backyard. And then I'll put the wood ash into my compost.
Yeah, of course. If you like having fires, that's a great way to get rid of those too.
But I do take the leaves off first, and I'll just leave the leaves to compost and only take the bigger branches for the burn pile.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's my strategy.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to use this organic material, you know, either as fuel or as to make compost or various items. So yeah, so kind of getting into the compost bin. So we'll be giving away 50 of the geo bins to qualifying Seminole County residents today. But can you tell us about this one on the left here that I think Winter Park gives us away, right?
Yeah, that's the earth machine that the city of Winter Park offers in their composting system. If we have anybody here from the Winter Park city, then I can add that link in the chat box. And then the bin on the right, that's at our Orange County Extension Center in our vegetable garden demonstration area where we have the 3-bin compost. So that one, it's open to the air, so it's getting more aeration, and it's also open to the rainfall. One of the problems with some of these earth machine bins on the left is that lid, it's locking lid, so it keeps the raccoons out, but it also keeps the rain out. And so if you have one of those black bins with a lid, you might have to water it a little bit more to make sure that you have a little moisture for your materials.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot of different types and styles. Here pictured, we have you know, another couple versions of the 3-bin system. Essentially, once you fill up that first bin on the left, or if you want to start on the right, however you want, you're going to fill up one of those bins completely till it's full. And then you're going to let it sit. You're going to say, okay, this is kind of closed down. You're going to move to the next one, fill that up because we're constantly creating the debris, and then move to the next one. And I've even done this in just a one cell. So I've taken some pallets, put them together into a compost, you know, make a little compost bin out of that. And then when it's done and ready to go, I take the pallets and move them somewhere else in the yard. And that's kind of cool too, because then you don't have to move it. You just let that pile sit. And then the next season, you're ready to plant your garden there. So there's a lot of kind of savvy ways to do it without having to lug it and wheelbarrow it all over the yard if you're willing to kind of have that flexibility. Or, you know, if you want the static, say more commercial thing is on the top right there. So there's a ton of ways to do it. Obviously, we have these bins. There's also the rotator bins, which again, closed to rain, closed to sun, can be a little tricky with the nitrogen levels getting kind of squishy in there. So we want to definitely make sure we have that ratio, but these can be good for people who do have a hard time turning the pile and can just kind of crank the side wheel.
Yeah, and those are good for a batch composting if you just put all the materials in at one time. But if you're constantly adding new materials, you might have to use a little sifter, like wire mesh, to separate the finished compost from the materials that still need more time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like to do that even like if we're doing little seeds and seedlings, kind of sifting that compost to get the really fine, nice soil out of it. And then, you can plant your seeds in that, and it's just really delicate soil for them, because one little piece of mulch and that new little seedling is squished. So kind of using the sifter on the back end. Here you can see, just a simple barrel with holes drilled for aeration. The pallet one here on the bottom right, we have a wood one. So people get really creative, and if you want something built to last, or if you want it just for a season, it really is just going to be kind of you're choosing what resources do you have available. This is kind of like our geobin, but it's made out of the chicken wire. So basically, you can just drill a few stakes in the ground, wrap some of that chicken wire around it, and then make sure that you secure it with either a zip tie or some kind of securing, and then just start filling it up. So you got your layering going on, or again, if you want to do just a quick batch, this one looks like it's filled with hay and maybe some manure, maybe some leaves. You get a bunch of leaves, and you just kind of want to just let it sit. These can be a good addition.
Yeah, and those kind are really easy to move, those chicken wire ones. You can just like take it apart, move it over, turn the compost pile. And then we had somebody in the chat mention that they have bears going after their compost. So you're going to need a really sturdy bin, something really strong. Or you could even consider, getting like an electric composter, like in the house, that shreds the compost up first and then putting it out into the compost after it's already broken down.
Yeah. And even for those of you that are in our bear zone, bear ordinance area over in the Wekiva area, maybe even one of these tumblers. Again, it's not the perfect situation, but this can be a really good bear proof, thing. Once it's locked, they're not really going to be able to get in there. So, definitely if you're in a bear ordinance area, consider composting with real judiciousness, because we don't really, we don't want to be drawing our bears in. And a lot of the times these compost piles can do that. So just really use caution with that. Another way, kind of the final way we have for composting, is just an old fashioned pile. Like Tia was saying, on the farm, you got a bunch of materials, you got a bunch of manure, you put it all together, and you just let it build up over time, covering it with leaves. And you come back several months later, and this is kind of what it looks like. So, even just a small pile is something that can enhance your soil. And again, you don't need any materials to make this process happen, because it's something that, Earth naturally does. So looking at the size, we really don't want to get too much bigger than that 3 by 3 by 3 foot. And that's because it can, that's going to effectively retain heat. And when it gets larger than, say, 5 feet, it might be difficult for that aeration to occur. So you can see on our last slide, that was quite a big pile, and it was very compact. And so that might be more of a commercial situation, again, on a farm or something, it's more appropriate. It's just going to take a little bit more time for that to actually break down, because of the lack of oxygen. And so again, allowing that aeration, getting it in there, that 3 feet is going to be a manageable size to turn and allow that oxygenation.
Yeah, kind of getting that sweet spot of like 3 feet, to get enough bulk, but you don't want to get too much that it's not manageable. And a little bit about the location, you want to put your compost bin in an area that it's easily accessible. I like to put mine where I can stand on my back porch and play basketball and throw my apple core out to my compost. If you live in a homeowners association, you might have to consider where you put it. They might require that you keep it out of sight of the front yard, for example, in the side yard or in the backyard, and put it in an area that you're just able to access it, to go in with a pitchfork and turn it. It kind of likes part sun, part shade. If it's in too much sun, you might get it too hot. If it's in too much shade, you might, it might just decompose slower. But either way, compost is still going to happen. So don't worry too much about it. And then put it in an area where you have room to work. Maybe you have a couple bins next to each other. Don't put it, right up against your house or right up against your neighbor's fence. And don't put it, if you have a well, don't put it right next to your well either, because some of those nutrients can leach down, even though your well is probably a couple 100 feet deep. And then one last thing is to make sure that you have it in an area that you can give it some water. One way to keep it wet is when you're washing out your compost bin or something, just dump that rinsate right into the pile, cover it up, and that will help it keep moist.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so there's benefits to the full sun, there's benefits to the full shade, but yeah, I think a part sun, part shade type of a location is great. So let's talk a little bit about layering. Tia's mentioned that sandwich method, and here on this slide, you can see kind of how we're doing a layer of browns and a layer of greens. And, it doesn't have to be this pristine and kind of perfect. It can literally be, okay, I'm putting in my kitchen scraps from my bucket, and now I'm going to cover it with some leaves. And that's a layer. That's a couple layers. So start with the base layer. Like I said, add some sticks or some corn husks or something to the bottom to kind of give it a foundation and allow that aeration to take action. And then you're just going to start doing that nitrogen green layer, carbon brown layer, and so on and so forth on a daily basis, and keep alternating it until you're about 3 feet high. Now, one thing is that this is going to be elevated, and then as it begins to break down, it'll reduce. And so you might be at 3 feet, and then a week later you're at 2.5 feet, and then you're going to kind of play this game until you're looking at the pile and you're saying, all right, now we're pretty solidly at 3 feet, and I'm not seeing it kind of squishing much more. And so that's where you kind of want to say, okay, I'm going to let the pile rest and go to my next area to
or you can just keep adding to the pile. That's what I do to mine. I just have one compost pile. I keep adding to it. And somebody asked in the chat box if the layers are lost. And yes, they are. Like these pictures on our slides are kind of glorified, representations to the best of our artistic abilities. But if you just have one pile that you're turning, and then you add some new food to it, what you want to do is you want to dig a little hole in the top of it, in the center, maybe about 1 foot deep, add your fresh compost, and then pull the rest of the pile up on top to cover that fresh food. Make sure you're always covering the fresh food waste with some, compost materials or some extra layers of brown.
That's right. Yeah, it's paramount to make sure that those greens get covered. Because if not, you're going to be drawing in all of the little critters, and we don't want to do that. So to manage aeration, of course, we have what we usually call turning, but I think turning gives a different connotation, because when people think, you're turning the pile, you don't have to toss it around every time that you turn it. It can just be a simple, again, pitchfork in, kind of wiggling it, aerating it, and that is going to do the trick. Now, of course, you can turn it, and that does help to speed up the process. But essentially, you want to keep that core pretty hot. That's where the microbes are going to be, and the digestion is going to be taking place. So you can see here on the top, you have that hot core in the compacted area, and then the heat is kind of coming in and going up. So you get cool air entering to the pile, and then the vapor. And on a cool morning, if you do have a hot pile, with manures and such, you will see that water vapor and warmth coming from that. If you don't have that, it's okay. But, you know, really hot, kind of more commercial grade piles will have that heat coming off. So for watering, again, like Tia said here, you're going to have to water those closed systems because they're just not getting the rain. So it is nice to have an open face, an, you know, top kind of without a top system, because then you'll be able to take an advantage of that rain. But, you know, if you're in an area with lots of critters, you might need that lid, and then you can just, you know, kind of use the water that you have available to keep that pile moist. So we could see in this image, this is just a lot of browns. It's very dry. I would add some greens to this, and I would definitely add some water as the person is doing. So yeah, sorry, the title is kind of blocked here, but yeah, basically, sorry, yeah.
What is the temperature of the pile?
Yeah, so for temperature, you know, again, this is kind of one of those things that we're getting really scientific about it. You don't have to get the temperature of your pile if you don't want to. If you want to, you know, kind of nerd out and have fun with it and get a thermometer, you can and see where it's at. And, you know, that's fun too, but it's not necessary. Essentially, you know, you'll know if your compost is happening, if you're using those right browns to greens ratios. You know, you want that range to be about 122 to 131. Once you get hotter than that, we see this 131 to 140. This is with like a more commercial piles. So, you know, maybe at Disney, they have a professional digester, or at Orange County landfill, they have that professional digester, and they're going to be getting up to 140, and they're going to maintain that temperature pretty steadily and average, and that's going to destroy a lot of the weed seeds and pathogens. Anything above 149 is where we do start to see the microbial activity decline. So we don't want it to get too hot, because we can kill the microbes that are doing the lion's share of the work for us. So, you know, if you're in the 122 to even 140 range, you're perfectly fine. And, you know, again, it just depends on the location of your pile and you know, the various aspects of that.
Yeah, and if you're below that too, it's not a big deal. I'm kind of on the more lazy side of the composting, and my pile might be between 80 and 100 degrees year round, because I'm not frequent in turning it, and I just add materials as I have them. So don't get too caught up in the temperature. Also, those higher temperatures, they're the ones that are going to kill the pathogens, about 145 degrees to 155 degrees, you know, for 72 hours. That's the temperature that you need to kill some of those plant diseases and pathogens. So, you know, if you are, you know, being a little bit more liberal and adding some more meat and stuff, you might want to try to get the temperature a little bit higher. But, you know, in the end, compost happens and it's all good. And if you have any questions, hit up me and Tina.
Yeah, so now we're getting to the good part. We've talked all about what can we put in, and, you know, how to do it and how to speed it up. So how do we know when it's ready? Well, it's going to be about at least 6 weeks. That's if you're really doing all the best management practices. And but if, you know, if you are kind of more on the lazy side of things, it can be 6 months to even 2 years. So if you're adding a lot of leaves and not really adding in your greens and stuff, then it might take a couple years. You know, you might go back and say, wow, you know. And in Florida, this process does kind of happen quicker, I would say, than in the rest of the country, just because we have so much rain and heat. But, you know, it could be a variety of outcomes depending on what you input. Essentially, you know, it's not about the time frame, and it's similar with irrigation. You know, people want to say, like, how long should I run my irrigation, or how long should I keep my compost? It really is about how much is our irrigation applying to our landscape. Well, let's measure it with a cup. how, how does our compost look? Does it look like a rich, nice, crumbly, kind of fluffy, compost, or does it look kind of still chunky and like a lot of stuff that needs to get broken down? So getting that understanding of what that looks like is really paramount. And then, essentially these microbes are just chowing down and eating all of the various things that you've put in. So Tia, do you want to tell us a little bit about troubleshooting some odor and like, what do I do if my pile stinks?
Yeah, there's a lot of troubleshooting things we can go over here. So remember, compost happens, and so stay calm. But if you are smelling something like a bad odor, that is not a good sign. That's a symptom that something is a little bit out of balance in your compost pile. Usually odor comes from too much nitrogen materials. Like if you add a whole bag of fresh green grass clippings in the middle of summer at one time, or you add a whole trash can full of orange peels, that might cause an odor. And so what you can do to fix that is to kind of stir up the pile to add aeration and oxygen. You can also mix in brown material, and that way it will disperse those green materials that are kind of making it too wet and stinky. And then also top it off with extra browns. If you have some mulch or sawdust or cardboard, you can add that type of stuff to it. Turn the pile, top it off with more browns.
Yeah, and so we do see this kind of occurring with those closed systems that, they're not getting the water, they're not getting the, the light and the, so we want to kind of add in those extra browns.
Yeah, if your compost is too cool, that's not a problem. But if you're trying to make compost faster, you want to get a little heat building in there so those microbes can be, get into that zone of the good microbes that are really working hard. And so what you can do to bump up the temperature of your compost pile is to make your pile a little bit bigger. If your pile is a little small, it will be cooler. Make the pile a little bigger. Add some of those hot nitrogen materials, some of the fresh food scraps. Maybe stop by your local juice bar and get that bucket of, shredded carrots and everything they have. You can also turn it to give it more air, and that will help to, stoke those microbes again a little bit more. Another reason it could be too cool is if it's too dry and like the leaves are just sitting in there and they're all dry, they're not kind of actively composting because they don't have any moisture. So, also too much moisture, like when we get those heavy summer rains, I usually don't, but you could consider covering your compost, with a tarp or something. So it's just not being drowned out by those heavy summer rains. So again, if it's too cool, just mix in some more materials, turn the pile, and check the moisture.
Awesome. And I actually get this question a lot about pests. So even like, what if I get ants in my pile? Or, what if I have cockroaches, or if I have, different types of insects? Well, really we're targeting the microbes, but we will typically get other types of insects and arthropods, worms, things like that. And most of them are not going to hurt the pile. So, we want to kind of, with integrative pest management, we want to be realistic. This is not in our home. If it is a worm bin and it's close to your house or in your carport, that's kind of a different situation. But, typically the pests are not a problem. We just want to make sure that we're putting that food deeper into the pile, that we're burying it, we're putting the putting the browns on top.
Yeah, and if you have a problem with like fire ants too, even rats, just kind of actively keeping the pile and turning it here and there, that will help to keep those kind of pests out. And then like the bigger things like raccoons and bears or dogs, you just need to have a sturdy bin that can withstand, those pests. Maybe the bin with the locking lid is the right choice for you. Or if you have, extreme problems, you could go with like chopping the compost up really fine and then putting it in there, but always cover it, and that will minimize the pest problem. So that brings us to this slide, where to get extra inputs. You might be like in the middle of summer and you're just like, well, I don't have any more bags of leaves anymore. And so you want to bulk up your compost pile. There's a lot of places where you can get extra inputs. I talked about stopping by the smoothie bar or the juice bar and asking them for their compost. If you have a neighbor that has horses or cows, you can stop by there. The zoo has a product called Zoo Doo, which they take their herbivore type of animals like elephants and giraffes, and they collect that manure, the Zoo Doo, and you can go pick that up. You know, you have to call your zoo and see if it's available. Often you can have it for free. Like classroom pet litter, like your little rabbit, you know, with the little paper bedding and the little rabbit pellets, that's fine to put in there. In my yard, I also like to grow different crops for specifically my compost pile. Like grasses are a great source of carbon. The clumping grasses that, you know, everyone's giving them a little haircut right now at this time of year to make them all fresh and green again. So you can grow a couple extra grasses, kind of like a hay factory, and just keep, you know, chopping those, adding it to the compost pile. Gingers and like bananas, those leaves are very herbaceous and decompose rapidly. You can check with local restaurants, you know, the produce store, whatever they're throwing away. Sometimes they give it to pig farmers. Sometimes they'll let you have it. And then the paper waste is another thing that is kind of an underutilized thing to add to our compost. So if you have a paper shredder, you can be shredding up your junk mail. If you have newspapers, you can go ahead and rip them and shred them up. You do want to rip them up a little bit before adding them to your compost pile. Otherwise, it will just kind of sink together in a big mat. So those are some great places. Somebody in the chat mentioned Starbucks coffee. Yeah, you can get there. And then a resource that Lori shared is www.sharewaste.com. And so they bring their kitchen scraps and then she feeds it to her worms. What a great idea.
Very cool. Yeah, there's so many places to get that stuff in our society that take advantage and grow your compost pile. Just a quick note on trench composting, because I have had questions about it. It's perfectly acceptable to do, you know, especially if you might not be encouraged to compost within your neighborhood, or you have certain restrictions, that you could just kind of dig a hole, a little trench, you put all the materials in. It is kind of a one and done. So this isn't something that you would be constantly adding to. It would just be, okay, we're going to take this, you know, bulk of scraps, we're going to put it 6 inches into the soil below ground level, and then kind of cover it up. And then the next season, maybe planting a garden in that area, or just, you know, being able to have that enhanced soil for any plants that you would add. And then again, compost tea, you know, there's lots of different ways to compost. So for compost tea, essentially you're putting that completed compost, so nothing that has a lot of big chunks or where you can see what it was. It's pretty much that completed compost humus, and you soak it in water for about a day. This ratio is about 1 cup of compost to about 10 cups of water. And that essentially will just create a tea that you can dilute and add water to, and you know, utilize that in your garden to enhance the soil. And you really want to, it's important while you're making the tea to provide some aeration. So just like you would with a tea bag, kind of raising it in and out. You don't want it just kind of sitting there and not really longer than a day to be able to do that.
Yeah, and then some people like to do worm composting too. I have a normal compost pile. I also have a worm bin, or do vermiculture, which is just a fancy name for worm culture. But these are special types of composting worms that will eat your food scraps. They naturally live, above the ground as opposed to the regular earthworms we're used to that dig and burrow below the ground. So the worms will break down your food scraps, and you can use paper or coconut coir as a bedding. And they have layers in the bin, like in the photo to the right here. And so you can have one active bin, and then the bin beneath that is decomposing. And then the bottom bin will be fully decomposed. And then you can rotate them, harvest the finished worm castings. And this is good for people who live in apartments or small spaces. You can even keep it under your kitchen sink. It does leak a little bit from the legs from time to time, depending on what bin you have. So you might want to put something under it, just in case. But this is a great, this is kind of top notch here. We call it black gold because the worm castings are so rich, and they really speed up the breaking down process for your food scraps that you put in there. So we teach a whole nother class on this, keep posted for that class. And we just wanted to touch on it today to let you know it's another option out there.
Yeah, I like switching between the real in the garden bin, a little bit in the worm bin, and kind of back and forth. So it's a nice supplement.
Yeah, and let me just reiterate here that earthworms are all beneficial. There's many different species of them. So they are an indicator of good quality soil, although you may not find them in your compost pile because the compost pile might be a little bit too warm from them, especially if you're turning and trying to get it heated up. But worm bins, the earthworms, they help the soil. They create little burrows that help, move nutrients and air in the soil. And so you don't really want to go and pick up the earthworms and add them to your worm bin container or your compost pile. Just let them be in the environment.
That's great. So just thinking about managing leaves in our yard, we want to not only utilize them in our compost piles, but we could even just add them to our landscape and cover it with the mulch and recycling that yard waste, finding ways to integrate these valuable resources, not bagging them and sending them to the curb, but actually integrating them into our landscape. And we can do that by raking them up. And, right now there's a lot of leaves still falling. So, bag them and put them by your compost pile so that you can utilize them all year to have those browns readily available. And then use them as mulch. You can use them in your pathways. You can use them in your landscape beds. And grass clippings can also be a great addition. So having those grass clippings not in our storm drains, allowing them to just stay right there on our lawn is the best way. When they go down our drains, they tend to not only be a bad thing for hurricanes and flooding, but they do add nutrients not to our where we want it, which is our landscapes, but into our waterways. So then, once we have this great product, how do we use it? How do we apply it to our landscape? Well, as a soil additive, we want to add about 1 to 3 inches of compost to the soil surface and mix it about 4 to 6 inches in. So here you can see they're spreading the compost around and then starting to kind of integrate it into the soil as an enhancement. For a potting mix, you might want to mix it with maybe some sand, some perlite, vermiculite, and that'll help to improve the drainage because sometimes compost can kind of take up. And so the vermiculite and perlite gives it that sponginess. So, now it's just a matter of getting those scraps, saving them, getting a system in place for you and your family and friends or your roommates. Because, this is really a team effort. If somebody's eating and they're not on board with where the scraps go, so have a little conversation with your household that, y'all want to start composting and all the benefits that you learned about today so that everybody can get involved and everybody can kind of enjoy the benefits to recycle these valuable things. So just to close us out, and I do apologize because we ran over. Tia and I just love to talk about composting so much that we did run about 10 minutes over. But hopefully we answered at least a few of your questions as we were going. And we did have about 125 people joining us today. 50 of you that live in Seminole County will be receiving a GeoBin for free. We will allow you several days to complete this survey. So somebody schedules the webinar for us. She has to give me your emails. I have to wait for her to do that. So she's going to give me your emails. I'm going to send you the survey. You complete the survey as soon as you get it. Even if you're not a Seminole County resident, please do it. It really helps us. And that's what makes it so we can do this programming for free today. And after the survey is completed in just a few days, early next week, if you are a lucky winner, I will be in touch with you about a pickup, hopefully sometime next week. But please just hang on tight. I will reach out to you if you are a lucky winner, and we'll schedule pickup for pickup at the University of Florida IFAS Extension in Seminole County in Sanford off of 1792. We'll also be emailing you in 3 to 6 months to see if you are composting. So you'll get a survey now, and then you'll get a survey down the road that will, we'll just kind of check in with you and see, how are you composting? How's it going? What are you doing? Do you have any questions? So please keep a lookout for that. And with that, we have our contact information here. Check out our website. If you need to give a call, there's our information. And then we can take a look at the Q&A, and Tia has done a great job. Thank you, Tia, helping monitor the chat and the Q&A. It's difficult here with this one screen to be able to accommodate all of the chit chat and whatnot.
Right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I have been answering some of the questions, but we will stay and answer some more. Someone is asking about Spanish moss, green or brown?
That's a great question. So Spanish moss is what we see in our, oak trees and our towering Central Florida trees. It's actually not a true moss. It's a bromeliad family. So it's actually the same as a pineapple, if you can believe that. It's not a true moss. And so that matters because it's very fibrous. So it is going to be more of a brown. It's, I don't know exactly what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is, but if I had to guess, it would be pretty high on the carbon. So, you can use that. Those fibers are very strong. They used to use them in textiles, actually, historically. So it's good to use that judiciously, because it might take a while to really break down. If you were able to somehow chop it or, make it into smaller pieces, that could be a good addition. So any additions there, Tia?
No, it is kind of stringy and it wants to get caught in my pitchfork. So maybe cut it up into smaller pieces to help it decompose. So next question, Tina, are the chicken wire compost piles easy to mix with a shovel?
Yeah, so those are kind of a little tricky to get into. I will say that, they're easy to make, and since they're you're not making them really that big, they are difficult to get into to turn it. Essentially, from what I've seen, really you just kind of layer it and then set it and forget it in a way. So you're going to kind of layer it in. Once it's full, you just kind of leave it, make a new one in another part of the yard, and just kind of build it up. So it really is kind of a more lazy style where you're not really turning a lot, getting in there, getting access to it. So again, find a pile, find a compost pile or whatever that works for you,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Next question, can seeds be included in the compost, such as squash or apple seeds?
Yes, but beware that they will likely germinate, and that can be a great thing or it can be a not great thing. So Again, our invasive species, our weeds, we don't want to go there. We don't want to harbor them. But things like squash, you know, they might end up in there and we might get a really cool squash, or it might hybridize, you know. And actually, when I was working at the Arboretum over at UCF, we had some compost squash hybridized, and it was a watermelon cucumber kind of a thing. So, you know, just kind of be aware of that, be careful with that. Especially if you are growing some heirloom things that you really are valuing. So, it can be a nice addition, but you know, like with my Everglades tomato, they seem to just sprout up out of my compost bin. And they are pretty consistently that little Everglades tomato. So I'm perfectly fine with that. But with my squashes, you know, sometimes having, you know, squashes can intermix. And so we want to be careful with that.
Yeah, I have an awesome papaya tree that grew out of my compost, and it just cranked out huge, delicious papayas. You know, for better or worse, it sucked up all my good stuff out of the compost, but I had delicious papayas. So.
Yep. I've had papaya seeds for sure come up out of the compost, and they've done well as well. So, you know, it just kind of depends. Be very careful with those species that are unwelcomed, is my only kind of caveat with that.
All right, next question. Can I add water from a freshwater fish tank?
I don't see why not. I mean, if you have a lot of fish and it's really dense, but I don't see why not, because that's really fish emulsion, I think. Is that, yeah, is that right? It's fish emulsion.
Well, it's kind of like ground up fish, but they're just talking about the fish water. So yeah, I don't see a problem with using that in the compost.
Should be
Salt
fine.
water wouldn't be good, but fresh water should be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Just be careful, you know, you don't want that gravel. If sometimes you have that little gravel at the bottom, you know, you might not want to add that in, because then you'd have to buy new gravel. So, but the water should be fine. It's just fresh water with a little fish poo. That should be fine.
Okay, next question. How important is turning if compost happens? Great question.
Yeah. So, you know, kind of like we were saying, if you're in the busy / lazy camp, you really don't have to turn at all. And if you're really have laser focused on that goal to make humus and use it in your garden, maybe even on a timeline where you're like, I want by August to have awesome compost for my fall garden, then you're going to want to turn it. So it kind of, again, goes back to that initial slide of what is your goal? You know, is our goal to make humus in a timely fashion for our garden? Or is our goal to kind of be more lackadaisical about it, defer waste from the landfill, which is great, and get compost kind of when we get compost? You know, or somewhere in the range of that spectrum, you know, that's a question for you to decide, but turning is not critical. You know, the compost will happen regardless.
Yeah, that's right. Compost happens. So how do I make banana tea compost?
I'm not familiar.
Misunderstood us.
Say again?
But we've talked about making tea, compost tea from cured compost after it's finished biodegrading.
Correct. And we did actually get a question similar to this in our fruit trees class last year. I think it's got to be an internet sensation or something that I just missed the bus on that one. But I'm pretty sure people are making compost out of just banana peels. But I'm not sure what the science is behind that. I mean, really, I think what we would recommend is using those banana peels to make the compost, and then using that compost to make compost tea. That's just going to be much more of a holistic kind of composite rather than just the banana. I feel like if you just put a banana peel in water, it's going to get strange. So I'm not sure what the science is on that. But stick with, like we talked about, the compost tea, which is using the actual compost to make the compost tea.
Yeah, when you're using those raw materials, you just can create a habitat for anaerobic bacteria that might be harmful to your plants. So you have to be careful. That way, they like to use the aeration where you're stirring the compost tea or using the aquarium bubbler for 24 hours, and the aeration keeps the beneficial, aerobic microbes that are safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question. I'm using a tumbler. Is there a way to accelerate the process?
I think just the general practices, like we had mentioned, being sure to cut up those small pieces. So if you have a banana peel, trying to cut it up a little bit smaller, making sure that you are kind of turning it on a daily basis, or at least every 3 days, I would say, if you're going to be dedicated about it. Making sure that it's well watered, that you are getting water in there, because if it's a closed system, you're not getting access to that rain. And so we want to make sure that you're getting water in there. What am I forgetting, Tia?
Yeah, you can add a little, compost activator or like nitrogen type of stuff, or make sure you're getting the microbes in there since it's not contacting the soil. Maybe add some of your fresh garden soil or some leaves from the forest to, get it inoculated.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Next question. For the big brown leaves, do I have to break them down first?
Well, I mean, like with anything, the smaller you make that piece, then the microbes have more edge to go at. And so, ultimately that big leaf will break down, without doing anything, if you just put it in the compost pile, but just like it happens in the forest. But when you break it up into smaller pieces, now the microbes have multiple points of entry on multiple pieces. And so the process speeds up. So again, it goes back to your goals. An easy way to do this, I learned from a master gardener, is you get a trash can, put the leaves in, put in your weed whacker, poke it around a little bit, and then, your leaves will start to break up, and then use them like that. That can be a nice one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's all the questions that we have. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be sending a recording of the webinar as well as the links that we shared today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tia. And when's your next class, Tia? When can they find you again?
I'll be doing a butterfly gardening class on March 30th.
Excellent. Well, stay tuned, everyone. Keep in touch with us on social media. And again, for those of you lucky 50 winners, I will be in touch through email with you as soon as possible, but please be patient. Give me maybe till next week to get in touch with you. And with that, thank you all very much again for joining us today. And we'll look forward to hosting you next time.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great day. Happy composting.